Are you feeling bare minimum Mondays? How about lazy Fridays? Is hump day getting really, really hard for you? Well, we may have a solution. Putting some skin in the game by becoming part owner in your place of employment.
Having ownership in your place of employment won't only increase your productivity and job satisfaction, it can also help build LGBTQ generational wealth, wealth that is transferred from generation to generation within the queer community.
This is Queer Money episode number 550, and today we're joined by Annie Winkler, who uses they, them pronouns, and was one of the attendees at our recent Queerness and Business Conference in Winooski, Vermont, where we spoke in June. Annie advocates for business owners to turn their businesses into co-ops, allowing employees to have true, actual ownership in their place of employment, improving worker productivity and morale, and creating wealth.
Without further ado, let's get on with the show.
Capital One Auto Navigator does more than just auto financing. We're here to help you find a car you love, too. Shop millions of cars from thousands of dealers nationwide. Research your favorite makes and models. Explore dealers near you and more. All on Auto Navigator.
So welcome to the Queer Money Podcast, Annie Winkler.
That is my name, yes.
I know when we were talking about having you come on the show, all I've got in my head, and you probably hate this, is Michael Jackson. Annie, are you walking? Are you walking?
Yeah. It's not uncommon, but it doesn't happen every day, so that's nice.
It's better than Janie's Got a Gun, right? So.
Yeah.
And do you mind sharing your pronouns with us?
I do not mind. I use they, them pronouns and generally identify as non-binary.
Awesome. Thank you. We appreciate that.
Yeah.
So today, folks, we are going to have a discussion around a topic that John and I really weren't that clued into until we went to the state of Vermont, to
beautiful Burlington and Winooski.
Right, Burlington and Winooski. And Annie approached us and said, I think that you guys need to know a little bit about this topic. And it's adjacent to something that we have talked about before, and that is what we did an episode on employee stock purchase plans, and basically how employees can take ownership or gain ownership in the company that they're working for. With that, before we step into that, I kind of wanted to ask your kind of general view of what we do see being talked about a lot today, and that is this idea that a lot of employees are out there saying that they don't love their jobs. Why do you think that is the case?
Oh, there's so many reasons. I was thinking about it a lot, and I think I'm gonna just have three reasons that I'm gonna give you today.
Yeah.
One is disempowerment, right? The boomers own about half of the firms in the United States, and they're not handing over or sharing the reins of control. That's true, right? They don't quite understand what sharing might look like. And maybe Gen Xers, millennials, we haven't yet stepped into those positions of power in ways that they feel comfortable with. But I don't really care if they're comfortable. That's my own personal take on it. And I think there's also this piece about how, starting in around 1980, there's a lot less money for the amount of productivity that we have as employees in any particular firm. So that gap, that productivity pay gap that the Economic Policy Institute has so eloquently made into lovely charts for all of us, just starts to feel more and more and more terrible. Like, how much harder do we have to work before we actually are rewarded for working hard?
Right.
And then the third thing that I like to think about is power, justice, and belonging all kind of together, right? Like, who's got the power? Is there justice in how we are implementing our systems? And do people feel like they belong? And I think that when we look at those things, generally the answers are the people who have the power have had the power. There isn't enough justice, and we don't feel like we belong. And I'm saying we in the largest queer sense of that word.
Yeah,
definitely.
That makes a lot of sense. I don't know if either of you are familiar with, but Ray Dalio, billionaire, Ray Dalio said the other day at a conference that him being part of the baby boomer class, he said that baby boomers had pretty much fucked everything over We inherited a great country and economy, and we've done everything to ruin it. And that's why everybody is angry at us. And I think it's pretty in line with what you said, specifically that first point is just they've kind of ruined everything. And also they're holding on to all the power. So they,
I know that there's lots of reasons. I think lots of reasons we could break down as to why they might be holding on to power. But I do think that one of the statistics that keeps on reminding me why baby boomers are staying where they're at is roughly 43% of baby boomers have nothing saved for retirement. And of those who do have money saved for retirement, 28% of them have $100,000 or less. So you're looking at 3 out of every 5 baby boomers are still still working because they have to work. And I think a lot of that has to do with what you mentioned, this idea of the wealth that has been created from productivity has not been passed down to the individuals. And John and I found a very interesting chart that looked at both income and when tax breaks for dividends started in the United States. So
like early 2000s.
Passing that wealth through to shareholders, and how those two you could pretty much overlay on top of each other and say it was in the early 1980s under Ronald Reagan, when all of these tax breaks for shareholders started to take place, that we started to see wages stagnant and the wealth just continually getting sucked up to the top of ownership. And it's that ownership that those are the people who have the power, the wealth. And we know in this country, sadly, wealth does provide power. And that's one of the missions of our podcast
and mental health.
As a community, the more well off we are as individuals, the more power we have as individuals. One, to tell toxic bosses to go fuck themselves, and also to be able to say, I'm not going to stay here, wherever here is, and live in this, right? Whether that's a job, whether that's a city, a state, wherever it is, we need to have that kind of power. So how does employee ownership play into this idea of employees and managers feeling about a company, or their feelings about the power structures within a company?
Yeah. Can I go a slightly different direction and tell you how I got involved in employee ownership? And I promise I'll get there.
Absolutely.
For sure.
Definitely. Would love to hear that.
Great. So I was a middle school and elementary school teacher for about 5 years. I taught in Western Massachusetts. I taught down in Costa Rica for a year. It was great. I highly recommend that. And I decided I was done being a teacher. And so I came back to the States and I needed a job. And my friend, Dan Rosenberg, had started a pickle factory in 2001. And it was a lacto-fermentation pickle factory. So think kimchi, think sauerkraut, but also think dill pickles, but without the vinegar. So it's just a saltwater brine sort of situation.
And David's asking, why would you do that?
I love
because they're
pickles.
real good. Oh yeah, no, they're really good.
All right, I have to try
So Real Pickles, well, you don't get to, because you don't live in New England, New Jersey, New York, and Pennsylvania, which is the only places where Real Pickles distributes. So the key thing there is I came back, I was ready to do something else. I've done some physical labor in my life. I know that I enjoy being able to look at what I've done at the end of the day and say, wow, that was 6,000 pounds of cabbages that we just shredded, or whatever it is, right? When you've got a team of people working together, it can feel really good. And so I joined Real Pickles in 2009. And Dan and his partner, Addie, had been thinking about how do we really lock in the mission of this business and make sure that when we transition out as owners, the business will continue with these values really baked in and will continue in this vein. And they looked at a bunch of different options. They looked at employee stock ownership plans, which are I'm going to refer to as ESOPs in the future. They looked at worker-owned cooperatives. I don't think they look at employee ownership trusts. I'll talk about them down the line here too. And what they ended up deciding was that a worker-owned cooperative was the direction that they thought we would probably want to go. There were maybe around 10 of us, 12 of us at the time total. And so we started a conversation, like if they were going to stick around but not be the only owners. If they could continue to be the kind of managers that they were, would some of the rest of us want to join them in owning the business? So this is around 2011, and all the way up through 2013, we were involved in this conversion process where we worked with some experts, with some lawyers, some accountants, to try to figure out what are the best bylaws and how do we really want to structure this new business. It's still the same thing we're doing. We're still making sauerkraut every day, but the way that we're thinking about what are we doing is all of us together are thinking about that. Yeah. And so Dan and Addie said, hey, if at least 3 other people decide that they're willing to go on this journey with us, we think we can do it. And lo and behold, 3 of us were just smart enough to say yes to that. We engaged in this process and really dug into how much should it cost to become an owner in our business? How much should it cost for us to buy the business from Dan and Addie? You know, like all of these different things that come up when you're buying a business were the same sorts of things, even though we were creating a worker-owned cooperative. And then how do we want to make decisions together? And what are the important things that we want baked into our bylaws that cannot really be changed very easily? So we completed that conversion in 2013, and I stayed at the business through 2021. So good long time at the business, felt really good about the work that we did there. In the beginning of that conversion, I started as just a person on the line making sauerkraut. And then I was the assistant production manager. Then I was one of the production managers. I took on HR, I took on IT. And then when we converted, I was also the founding board president for the first 5 years. So I had a lot of different jobs, often simultaneously with any small firm, you know how that goes.
Right.
And it was really just a great opportunity for me to both take my teaching skills and apply them. How do we do things together in a way that feels good for everybody? And learn a whole bunch of more skills like finance and organizing a business and really thinking through what are the things that are important. And so through that work, I really became energized about worker-owned cooperatives specifically, but broad-based employee ownership generally. And so now I work also with the U.S. Federation of Worker-Owned Cooperatives as a peer advisor, and I work for the Vermont Employee Ownership Center as our generalist. So I just put Band-Aids on things and help to figure out new systems and help other businesses become employee-owned, whether that's ESOPs, EOTs, worker co-ops, any of those things. And on top of that, I also am a consultant. I do facilitation work for businesses and nonprofits who want to do things differently, want to think about how their governance structure might not need to be so hierarchical. So that's how I got into this. And so my personal feeling, to answer your question about how does employee ownership change how you feel about your business, right? You show up every day, you might be grumpy. That's true. That doesn't change. But you show up every day knowing that the best you can do is important, right? Because if you work efficiently, if you work together effectively with your coworkers, if you find new ways of doing things that are going to make everything easier for everybody else, that means that at the end of the year, there's more surplus to share, right? Yeah. Because in a worker co-op specifically, what we're thinking about is the patronage or the amount of labor that I put into the worker co-op declares how much, if we have profits at the end of the year, how much of that money gets shared to each individual person. And there's complexities around how patronage is shared and whether it's immediately or later or any number of other things. But the moral of the story is when the company does well, it shows up for you. So you buy into the business, you invest in the business, a worker has a common stock share is what it's called. And then if you leave, whether you retire or you leave non-voluntarily, that comes back to you, right? Like that never, unless the business is going under, but let's not think about that because I don't want that to happen to anyone. So that common stock share always comes back to you. And then there's this other piece of at the end of year 1, at the end of year 2, at the end of year 3, we were making profits. And so that got shared on amongst the worker owners at the business. And I'm going to continue to get money from that for a little while. And that's great.
With no fees or minimums and no overdraft fees, banking with Capital One is the easiest decision in the history of decisions. That's banking reimagined. What's in your wallet? Terms apply. See CapitalOne.com/bank for details. Capital One, NA, member FDIC.
You know, it's interesting. While you were talking about that, one of the things I was thinking about is, and I don't know why this is like the second or third time that this has come up in the last couple of months. This whole idea when we were in elementary school, we would get a grade on respects other people's property, right? And
Cool.
so we're graded as kids. We were graded on whether or not we respect other people's property, but there wasn't a need for respects my own property, right? Because I think that there's a natural built-in, I won't say this for everybody, but I think that there is a natural built-in, I respect and want to take care of things that I own. And as employees who own part of the business, whether it's a very small fractional portion or a controlling portion of that, you still have that feeling of this is mine. I want this to do well. I want to see this. It is kind of, I hate to call it the American way, but we've grown up in this culture of we all take some responsibility of what we own and try to do a better job with what we've been given. And I think that really kind of bleeds into this idea of us as owners of a company. And there are plenty of days when John and I struggle, but there aren't days when I just look at John and say, "F this is all yours now. I'm going somewhere else." Right?
Yeah. We're going to figure it out together.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
So it sounds like then though that what that does really is it creates maybe a psychological or a motivational switch in the brain to say it changes the dynamic of the relationship with the employee and the company. And so because of that change in dynamic, that positions, are you saying then that has a greater chance of positioning the company for success because everybody is in pursuit of success, not necessarily how can I just get by today without getting yelled at or without actually having to work too hard because, for whatever reason, I don't really feel like doing it today.
Yeah. So in both worker co-ops and ESOPs, so those are the two main ways to have broad-based employee ownership in the United States. They've done a bunch of research about them over the past 30, 40 years. And they find that it fosters this like deep sense of belonging and motivation. And the people are more committed to the success of the business. And you can attract talented workers, right? Like you can be like, oh, hey, also this future thing where you can own this. If you're in an ESOP, you have to be vested, but if you're at a worker co-op, there's a trial period. It's different amounts of time for different co-ops. After a year at Real Pickles, you can become an owner of the business. And that doesn't mean you now get to go around telling everybody else what to do. So that's another key thing. Like co-ops and ESOPs have very clear structures. In the co-op world, there's this moment where you have to think about, instead of one person making all the decisions, we're going to split up the decisions that are operational and governance oriented. Governance oriented questions are these like, what are we doing, right? Like, what's the big vision, the strategic plan, the budget for our projections for the next 10 years? And operations is more, how are we going to enact the what are we doing on a day-to-day basis, right? So if we wanted to, and we did, we constructed a really big walk-in outside. It took a lot of money. That was a governance question because it was really big amount of money and it affected everybody. But who's going to be filling the walk-in on a regular basis? What job is that? Like how are we going to make sure that the vegetables ordered are arriving on time? That's all operations. So even after you become an owner in that particular company, you're not walking around being like, I'm better than you because you're not an owner yet, right? Like that's not happening either because your job role operationally is different than if you're on the board, that's great. And you can go to board meetings. Everybody's invited to go to board meetings and participate. And my favorite thing about worker co-ops is that, how in businesses, if you own 60% of the business, you have 60% of the control. At a worker co-op, it's one worker, one vote. That's it. So once you're invested, and at Real Pickles, it was $6,000. Once you're invested, your one vote cost is the same as the person who's been there for 10 years. Now, that said, we used a consent-based decision-making model, which was talking about, or the way that we used it was we're just looking for nobody to have any objections to a proposal that's coming forward. So it's not everybody's yay ha, but nobody's saying no, right? Because that's easier to get to. Because then we're just looking for a range of tolerance instead of this is what I want. We're looking for this range of tolerance of like, oh, that's good enough. And we're looking for the range of tolerance around what's the best for the business and not what's the best for me personally. Right. So you got to take that personal hat off, put on that owner hat and be like, I own this business. I want this business to continue. If we give everybody $10,000 raises, there's not any more money, right? But how are we going to work towards that $10,000 raise amount that we want to be doing over the next however many years? How are we going to prioritize our budgeting in order to make that happen? Yes, that's an owner conversation.
Yeah, I love that range of tolerance because one of the questions I was going to have is we've been to board meetings and they've been miserable, and we've been on HOA boards, and it took a while for us to realize that we all don't have the same objectives in this HOA. Some of you are trying to just keep costs down at all expense, regardless of the consequences. Some of us are trying to keep the building safe and secure so it can stand for as long as we're living in here. We don't all have the same objectives. So I love that zone of tolerance because it kind of makes it position. It helps people to kind of focus on we're all focusing toward the same goal and not trying to manipulate things to our personal advantage.
Exactly.
So,
and with that, sorry, I just love talking. Apparently, the thing that you're just saying is reminding me, if you haven't had a values alignment moment where you've all been really clear about these are the values we're aligned on, it's a lot harder to come to a decision you agree about.
Right. Yeah. And I think that speaks to maybe this question of, folks, you know that we already did the episode on employee stock purchase plans, which oftentimes, I will say, I think it's roughly 40% of S&P 500 companies have employee stock purchase plans, and 35% of companies in the Russell 3000 have employee stock purchase plans. But oftentimes, even with those, the amount of shares that as an individual person is able to purchase is so tiny that it doesn't really have any impact on the decision making or the direction of the company. Is that really kind of the difference between a co-op and an ESOP, is that there's a little bit more of sharing of the decision making or the value decisions with a co-op?
Yes, and it depends. So ESOPs versus ESPPs, ESOPs are more broad-based employee ownership. So all full-time folks have a way to be invested, and it's not coming out of their pocket. The company is buying the stocks, and it's not just an incentive plan. So, and it is a retirement plan. That's true. So that's kind of the main difference. So that's the main difference between ESPPs and ESOPs. All the letters. And the main difference between ESOPs and co-ops is, and the ops don't stand for the same things either. I don't know why I emphasize that. But the main difference between those is that co-ops have democratic member control, and ESOPs don't have to, but can. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't co-ops that might be dysfunctional and might not be doing their best job in having democratic member control. But it does mean that ESOPs are not required to have democratic member control. They can. There are some ESOPs that are actually really wonderful in how they approach getting input and having decision-making shared amongst the employee owners. There are others that do less well at that.
You know, it's I don't know if this is true, but based on what you both have just said, the impression that I'm getting is when you talk about ESPP accounts, I'm thinking of our days working at Charles Schwab, and Walt Bettinger, who was and is currently the CEO, loves to talk about how he's one of the lowest paid CEOs in the country, because that makes it, I guess, less.
He only makes $600,000.
Yeah. But he gets paid hundreds of thousands of stock options a year,
right?
Millions of dollars worth of
worth millions of dollars.
Oh my goodness!
And so. The ESPP plan for him is way more profitable and beneficial and exciting than it is for the average Joe working on the phone thinking, oh, I've got my 50 ESPP shares. So it's almost like with ESPP accounts, companies are kind of saying, hey, you have ownership, wink and a nod, but we don't actually want to give you real ownership. We don't want you to actually have real autonomy and value
Yeah.
and secure
And
retirement
input.
plan. But that's what the
Yeah.
the what you're talking about would actually provide that.
Yeah. Well, and I also think, didn't you guys say in that ESPP episode that you had a $25,000 limit annually?
Yeah, there was a limit. Was it 25,000?
I don't
So
remember.
why isn't he limited?
Because it's part of his pay structure. Yeah, it's complicated. But
ridiculous.
it's like
Well, and most of his are not actually ESPP. He's getting stock
Oh, right.
grants.
Grants.
Right.
I
He
see,
gets-
yeah.
And that happens in a lot of companies. At the
Yeah.
executive and senior executive corporate structure is that every
Right.
year you're given these grants or warrants, which allows them to purchase shares of the company with their own money
Right.
versus it coming out of your paycheck every week or every month and then purchasing twice a year. It's the rich versus the rest of us.
Yeah.
Right. And
Well, one of the things I also love about worker co-ops, it's not written in stone. It's not a requirement for worker co-ops, but many of them have a highest to lowest pay ratio worked into their governing documents. So it might be 2-to-1, it might be 3-to-1. I don't know of that many co-ops that are higher than 3-to-1. I know of a couple. But generally, when you're thinking about who's the highest paid person at this co-op compared to a person just coming in the door, it's not more than 3 or 4, max 4-to-1.
okay.
So that's another thing that's just pretty awesome about co-ops.
so what?
But you wanted to talk about legacy planning.
Yeah, well, I guess, especially when I think about smaller companies,
Yeah.
it makes sense that this would be easier to do with a company that has maybe less than 100 employees, and very difficult to do for a company that's got 20,000 employees, right? So what are the benefits to an owner
Yeah.
who has a company where this might come up?
Yeah. So I think of like, let's say there's kind of like 2 companies where this comes up. One is sort of similar to Real Pickles, where there's an ideal that we want to enshrine in the business, and we're not necessarily thinking about leaving right now, but we're going to leave down the road, and we want to make sure that everything's ready for us to be able to leave once we're ready to.
Legacy planning as owners.
Yeah.
Legacy planning as owners. Yeah. So Dan Rosenberg only just recently quit being the general manager of Real Pickles. He's still consulting, of course. But that was 23 years after he started the business, right? And 11 after we converted to being a worker-owned cooperative. And we all, the 5 of us, all promised that we would stay there for at least 5 years. And of course, all of us did, because we were so invested in the process. I was the first person who left, and of those 5. And now they have well over 50% of the folks at Real Pickles are worker owners. Some people don't want to become worker owners for various reasons, and it takes a little bit more time and process to teach them about their voice being important and how to read a P&L, right? Stuff like that.
Right.
You
How to
asked a
stay
different
awake
question.
reading a P&L.
Yeah, right.
I have a friend who makes only 6-line P&Ls to make it easier for boards to read. And that's a good approach, right?
Yeah.
Because if you can get the big picture as a board, and yes, you should be able to read the really nitty gritty one, but if you can get the big picture first, then you can start having conversations.
Right.
So
question was
tax
the benefit to the
yeah,
owner.
I got it. It's taking me a second. So then the second kind of person is generally the kind of person who wants to sell their business. And with selling to employees, whether you're going ESOP, EOT, employee ownership trust, or worker co-op, you've got a built-in group of people who want the business to continue to succeed. That group of people knows how to run your business potentially very well, especially if you've been training them up in terms of how do you manage all of these things that we're doing. And especially if you're more of a hands-off owner, maybe the business is totally fine without you for a month, for 2 months, for 3 months. That is a great example of a business that probably could convert to employee ownership pretty easily. So there's tax benefits for both the company and the employee. I promised one of my coworkers I wasn't going to mention the 1042 rollover, but now here I am mentioning the 1042 rollover. To defer your capital gains taxes as a person selling a business, there's this fancy thing called the 1042 rollover, and it's similar to is it the 1031 with real estate investments?
Yeah.
Exchange.
So it's similar to that, where you can avoid capital gains taxes on the biggest sale of your life, right? So this is an important tax advantage for you to understand how to take. And that's true for both ESOPs and co-ops, although it's more commonly used in the ESOP world. And so benefits for that owner, there's built-in people who want to buy the business, who probably know how to run the business, who aren't going to run it into the ground, right? On purpose, if it's an acquisition from an outside company that just wants to get rid of the competition.
Sorry, we're gonna drop in all the assholes.
Great, we're in it to win it. And the other thing is, when you're creating an ESOP, you don't have to sell 100% of the company. You could retain a controlling portion of it. So you could only sell 49% of it to the employee owners. It could be a 49% ESOP, and that's okay. And then over time, as you get closer to retirement or closer to no longer on this planet, you could be selling the rest of the company to that ESOP as they prove that they're doing a good job. The basic gist of it. Oh, yeah, no.
Sorry, go ahead.
The basic gist of an ESOP is that you create a trust. The trust buys the company, or buys whatever portion of the company it's going to buy. And then the company helps the employees, it gives the employees shares in that trust. So that the trust is the one that is controlling the things. And there's outside advisors and any number of other things, but that's the main difference between co-ops and ESOPs that I have had a hard time wrapping my mind around. I want to just be clear, is who's controlling what? The main time when that trust is making a decision is if somebody's trying to acquire that ESOP. And so then the trust will decide in their fiduciary responsibility if it makes the most sense to sell the business or not for the employees. And the employees get the payout because they are the owners of that company. So that's one of those other windfall moments that can happen. Sure. Aside from in retirement, it could be that your company is purchased, maybe by another ESOP, that would be sweet, but maybe by outside investors. And then you got to ask yourself what's going to happen to the company, but that's a side issue. You just got a lot of money, so maybe you're happy.
Right. Yeah. Maybe you don't care. Yeah. So I guess what I'm concerned about or curious about is the moment when the owner of the company wants to officially retire. Technically, they could hold on to their shares, but not be an active day-to-day worker, I guess is for lack of a better word. But they could still retain ownership of their shares and slowly then sell them over time or sell them in one lump sum if they choose to.
Yeah, absolutely. And they could do the conversion at 100% right at the top and stay in leadership. There's basically 3 transitions that happen, right? There's the ownership transition. There's potentially a leadership transition. Eventually, there's going to be a leadership transition. No matter what, everybody's going to die. The leadership transition is going to happen. So plan for it. Know what you're going to do. Here first, folks. You're going to die. And then the other one is a culture transition, this democratic control in the case of worker co-ops, but definitely even at ESOPs, this culture transition of becoming employee owners. And what does it mean to own our company? How do we work well together so that we're getting the most out of this wonderful idea that we can broadly together own this company?
Right.
Gotcha. So I want to go back to a question or a train of thought that it was going down before. Is there an optimal size of company that this works best for?
Yeah, ESOPs work for any size of business that is big enough. And co-ops, I'm just going to say co-ops works for any size of business because that's what I want to be true. There is, in Spain, there's a conglomeration of cooperatives called Mondragon. They have, I don't know if it's tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people who work with them. It's a lot of people. And there's a bunch of different businesses within them that all belong to this group together. And they're all cooperatives as well. So it is possible in the United States, the biggest worker cooperative is, it's a 3-letter acronym, Cooperative Home Care Associates. They've got 2,000 workers. So it is possible to do at scale. right? You end up having a board that is a smaller proportion of your entire worker ownership body, that sort of thing. It's more representational and less direct, but it's possible. You can do it. Generally speaking, if what's happening is you are becoming employee owned because of a business sale, once you're of a certain economic size, you tend to go ESOP. And if you're lower than that, you tend to go co-op. And it's kind of similar once you're over, like, I don't know, if you're over 50 employees, most of the time folks are like, yeah, we want to be an ESOP. And if you're under that, most of the time, but there are reasons why you might go either way in either of those categories. The other thing about it is that there's a financial valuation that happens at ESOPs annually. So that costs money. And that might be a reason to not want your company to be an ESOP, because you want to keep that money in the business.
Right. That makes sense. That Spanish version, though, almost sounds like they've created their own in exchange.
Well, they have their own economy. They've got, they've got companies that make appliances, as well as IT companies, as well as, like, they've got a whole bunch of stuff. And during economic downturns in Spain, the companies that see the least closures, the least layoffs, they are the co-ops. And that's true in the United States as well, right? Like, because when you are making decisions together about what's going on for us, you make them with care. So at Real Pickles, at the beginning of the pandemic, like, we all talked together. What is it we want to do? We're an essential business. We all have to show up to work. Some people don't want to, are scared for valid reasons. So how are we going to manage our employees? And we are the employees, right? This is not, I'm not deciding for somebody else. I'm going to work too. And so we made hard decisions about splitting some shifts and figuring out timing and all that stuff, but we were making those decisions together.
Nice.
Yeah. So if I, as an owner of a company, or if I am an employee of a company and this sounds appealing to me, how do we get started? How do I nudge my owner boss, or how do I, as the owner boss?
Am I the owner boss? Is that why you're
me?
Yeah,
you are definitely the boss of this household.
You saw it, right?
I saw it. There was a nudge.
How do we start these kinds of conversations? How do we move on this if we want to?
Yeah, my favorite statistic is that 80% of the businesses that are listed are never sold. So if you're thinking that you're going to be able to sell your business, think again, right? And some of those businesses that are able to be sold, like I said before, might be being acquired to be able to be shut down, like those sorts of things. Is that what you want for this business that you have put your heart and soul and life into, right? So as a business owner, a lot of your identity is wrapped up in that. So you are talking about a major emotional shift. If you deny that, it's going to be harder for you. If you just accept it and get the support that you need, whether that's your friends and family, a therapist, a business advisor, all of these folks have tools to help you out, right? So that said, if you're an owner, you can get in touch with a business advisor or certified exit planner, the Small Business Development Corporation, SCORE. In New England, we've got the Center for Women in Enterprise. There's lots of folks out there who want to help you figure out what's happening with your business so that your legacy can continue. You want to get a business valuation. You want to know what it's worth. You remember how I said your identity was wrapped up in this business? You probably think it's worth a lot more than it is worth. Right? So getting some outside advice about what it's really worth so that you can start to think about what are the options out there, who could afford to pay for this thing. Develop that management team, right? Get them education in finance, facilitation, business plan, visioning, all of that important stuff. Talking about the transition with your employees, whether you're going to employee owned or not, is an important step. In the worker co-op world, transitions tend to take longer. They take more than a year, generally speaking. And in the ESOP world, they generally try to have them take less than 6 months. That said, that means that on the worker co-op side, a bunch of the culture building that needs to happen has been happening through the transition. On the ESOP side, it most of the time gets shuffled over to that second portion of time after the transaction has happened. And it often is more of a, oh, what's happening? Oh, you're creating an ESOP and we're going to do it. And as less on the worker co-op side, we're doing this thing together and we're going to make it happen.
Gotcha.
So yeah, discuss the transition with family and friends, make a written succession plan. Please write something down. If it's all in your head, that's somewhere. But if it's written down, you can start to find the problems with it, or you can start to find the really wonderful things to talk about with people with it.
Yeah.
There are local employee ownership organizations in many of the states have a state center. There's also the National Center for Employee Ownership, the U.S. Federation for Worker-Owned Cooperatives. In the New England area, we've got ICA Group and the Cooperative Development Institute. They are organizations that are uniquely positioned to help you transition to employee ownership specifically. And as I said, it's a transition of ownership and leadership and structure and culture, right? Yeah. So doing them at separate times is the best thing you can do for your company. If you try to do all three at once, you are just asking for failure, right? So if you can start that culture transition before you're ready to leave ownership, you're setting everybody up, you know? And if you can transition the business structure before you transition the leadership change, you're setting folks up for success. And that is the way of it. The most amazing thing for me on the co-op side is that there are lenders that specifically work with folks who are trying to buy the business, and CDFIs that are Shared Capital is a national organization. The Cooperative Fund of the Northeast obviously works in the Northeast, and they have good terms and often don't require personal guarantees for them. A pretty massive amount of money that you're going to need to borrow to buy the business from the seller.
Wow.
So you also asked about, like, what about folks who are employees who want to talk about this stuff? Ask your boss about their succession plan. Do they have one? Not in a button pushing way. Just like, hey,
what happens
I really
when you
want
die?
No. Hey, I want to really stick around here for a long time. I think you might be gone by then. What's the plan? Right? And in an environment where you guys can have the generative conversations about what could work. Start to engage in anything that is bigger picture that the owner is willing to share with you. Open book management is great. Visioning, strategic planning. Show them that you're invested, that you want to be there, you want to stick around. And if you're at a smaller business and you're like, maybe we could go worker co-op, the Federation and the Democracy at Work Institute is hosting the Worker Cooperative Conference in Chicago, September 12th to 14th. And that is a great opportunity. It is my favorite conference. To go and connect with other folks who are already involved in the co-op world.
Nice.
So, and that website is just conference.coop, which is just such an
How did they land that one?
Yeah.
Well, because it's the .coop. The .coop will get you anything.
Yeah, exactly. All right. So it does, it is a little bit of a prove yourself moment. You've got to get educated as an employee. Get yourself educated. Don't just go to your boss and say, "Hey, we want to take over the company and become a co-op," because that might sound a little bit hostile. Yeah,
hostile takeover.
Right.
For sure.
Exactly. But I do think that this is something we know that a lot of queer folks work in small companies, right? And we definitely need more generational wealth transferring within the LGBT community. And we know that thankfully, there are seniors in our community who did build businesses. I think of financial advisors who have a number of staff underneath them. I think of real estate agents who have an office with a number of realtors. There's a lot. I think there are a lot of different businesses out there. There are a ton of small businesses where people are making candles and creams and lotions and soaps and things like that. Those are some of those businesses have grown substantially, especially during the pandemic. So think about this, folks. If you are working for one of those companies and you love working for that company and you want to continue to help that company grow, this is something to think about as a way to not only help yourself with generational wealth, but also think about those that come after you with generational wealth.
Yeah.
So just...
can I say a thing?
Sorry?
I said, can I say a thing?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
When we were becoming when we were becoming a co-op, the buy-in was $6,000. We decided that together. There's a cooperator called John Abrams. He wrote this book, The Companies We Keep. It's a great book. Highly recommend. He's working on another book about leadership transitions that's going to be coming. I think he just put in his final draft. But the moral of the story is at South Mountain Co-op on Martha's Vineyard, they decided the price of admission should be the value of a really good used car, right? Like not one that's going to break down on you that you got to keep investing in. So that's, we decided $6,000. That's great. When the 5 of us bought into worker ownership, I was the only one of us who didn't have $6,000 lying around. So I had to borrow from my mother. She had to borrow from the bank on her house, and that's fine. But when I left Real Pickles, I had more than $20,000 in my internal capital account, right?
Wow.
So that is money that I invested in the business as my patronage, and I will get paid back gradually over time. We made a decision together about what that schedule is. So I was part of that decision making. I feel confident about it. I know how the business makes decisions, right? Like I'm not worried about that money disappearing. They might have a couple rough years here or there. That's okay. I know that when it's possible, I'll get paid back, or when they're in a really flush year, maybe I'll get a bunch more than I was expecting for that year. So when I'm thinking about generational wealth, I absolutely am thinking about queers owning businesses in this way, right?
Yeah.
Because it is the business having that money, my money invested in it, meant that it could do more things, right? Like it could buy more vegetables, it could carry more debt, it could whatever it was. And so it meant that my job was better because we were able to do more things effectively. And that was great. So my day-to-day was better because my long-term financial reality was involved. And that was great.
Yeah.
That is, I love that you brought that up, because John and I say this all the time. As individuals, the more stable we feel about our financial state, not just right now because I have $70 in my wallet, but because I have $70,000 set aside for future expenses, or I've got $700,000 sitting in a retirement account. All of those things help you feel more secure and have less anxiety today. Your financial health is your mental health too. And I think a lot of us forget that. But I do think this is a really important point of many queer people are fearful. In the study that we did with the Motley Fool in 2022 and 2023, people in our community said that they were scared to invest, one, because they didn't know how to invest, and two, they didn't know what to invest in. Well, right there, you're solving both of these questions by saying invest at least some of your money in the company that you have faith and confidence and want to continue growing and building. So this is as much of an investment topic for us here as it is being good employees and contributing back to the growth of the company and getting a kickback from that. It is really about long-term as well as the short-term.
And I didn't even tell you that the way we raised the money to buy the business from Dan and Addie was a direct public offering. So we had more than 77 or about 77 individuals and a foundation or two invest in Real Pickles as preferred shareholders. So they don't have any control over the business. They're just getting a dividend at the end of the year if we're doing well enough to give them a dividend. And there have been a couple of private offerings since then to raise money for the aforementioned very large walk-in out back. But those sorts of things where they're hard to find ways to invest in Main Street businesses. They're hard. But once you find them, once you get connected in the cooperative investing circles, like you can invest in co-ops.
Yeah.
It's really cool.
Yeah.
And then you're investing in people like me who are working at cool companies like that.
Exactly. Instead of it going into a gigantic company that we don't know who they're sending their money to politically. It's a lot easier.
If I could just sit down with you guys for like 2 hours to be like, okay, so where do I put it where I don't have to question everything all the time?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. I just need to go back through.
For you.
Yeah, always.
So one of the organizations that you work with is VEOC. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, the Vermont Employee Ownership Center has been around for 22 years, I think. And we help businesses convert from being sole proprietorships or LLCs over to worker-owned cooperatives and employee stock ownership plans and EOTs as well. Generally, we provide more technical assistance on the worker co-op side. We also can provide some financial assistance in the conversion and getting a valuation from a accredited valuator. I think that's the right word. Right now, I'm feeling a little tired.
Works for me.
Yeah.
Great. And so it's not hand holding. It's definitely like teaching you what you're doing and how you want to be doing it. But that's what we do. We help businesses become employee owned, and Vermont has more employee owned businesses per capita than any other state in the United States. And that means we have, in the low 20s because we have a really low capita. But regardless, we're working really hard to make more co-ops and more ESOPs and more employee ownership trusts in the world, because we think that this is the way that the economy is going to shift, right? We want more access to wealth, and this is the easiest. It's hard. It's still easier than a lot of other ways to start to get access to that wealth and that decision-making power.
But I'll say that this is something that our society is struggling with today. We own less and less stuff today, right? We don't own record collections anymore that we can inherit to or sell to other family members. We don't own our phones. We don't own our like so much stuff. We're subsidizing everything. Ownership is wealth. That's why property ownership is so profitable for so many people. So if you can get ownership of a company, that's another form of ownership that can diversify your net worth and increase your net worth.
Yeah,
absolutely. Totally.
So I know we could probably go on and on about this. There's lots of questions that you
so many,
especially if we have pickles here to eat and beer to wash it down with.
Next time you come visit, I'll hook you up.
Okay. So I know we could go on, but we want to respect your time. One of the things that we have been doing, especially with the climate of what's going on in the country right now, especially for our queer community, we've been asking folks, whether it's related to what we just talked about or something completely different, what's putting a smile on your face, making you feel good these days?
Yeah, I belong to a dragon boat team. And I'm going to explain that because some of your people don't know what I just said. Yeah. Dragon boat is a tradition from China and Hong Kong. And generally speaking, you take a canoe-shaped boat and you give it a lot of steroids. And you put in 10 bench seats and you put 2 people sitting side by side on each of those. So you got 20 paddlers. You got a person in back with a big steering oar, and you have a person in front banging on a drum to help you stay in time together. And this last weekend, we were up in Montreal, and there were 10 teams competing in our category, and we were not in the top 6, but we were the top of the bottom 4. So there were only 6 boats going out in any one particular heat, and we took home 3 gold medals for being the top of the bottom.
That sounds like a lot of fun. I've heard about that, but I didn't know anybody who was part of it. And
now you do.
Myself, so
there's a big event in Denver once a year for Dragon Boats, and we never went to it, but I did hear a lot about it. But it just does sound really.
It's
cool.
very fun. Well, and especially in North America, there's a really strong tradition also of folks who have survived breast cancer being involved. And that's wonderful. And the competition we were just at in Montreal, the Montreal Challenge, there were a bunch of teams from China who came over to compete as well. So that also is really great. It's a cultural exchange sort of program between Canada and China, that particular competition. So there's really there's just so many different aspects of how it can be wonderful. Like, you get your exercise, you're hanging out with 10 to 20 other people, working out really hard. You're very sweaty. You're on a beautiful lake. We're on Lake Champlain. It's sunset. It's the end of the day. You're going for a swim. It's beautiful.
Sounds awesome.
Awesome. Love it. Well, thank you very much. We've enjoyed having you on the Queer Money podcast. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
How can our listeners and viewers connect with you or your organizations?
I'm at anniewinkler.com. Very easy. VEOC.org is the little state nonprofit where I am. If you're outside of Vermont, the usworker.coop is a great way to get involved in the co-op world, and conference.coop is the particular conference that is happening September 12th through 14th in Chicago. And if you're in New England, I forgot to plug this earlier, and you own a business and you're thinking about this succession planning question, ownershiptransition.org/survey. We are trying to find you. We are trying to support you. We want to know what you're up to. ownershiptransition.org/survey.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much. We'll link to all of that in our newsletter this week, folks, if you want to get those details.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me.
The mission of Queer Money is to financially empower the LGBTQ plus community. Join us in thanking Capital One for supporting that mission. Thank you, Annie, for a great interview and for sharing such a unique idea about building generational wealth for LGBTQ folks. To our listeners and viewers, thank you again for joining us for another episode. Remember, you can get your Queer Money takeaway and the massive list of resources that was mentioned in this episode from this week's newsletter.
Then join us this Thursday for another bonus episode, and next Tuesday when we dive deeper into a topic about ways to make more money. Thank you and have an amazing week.
Cheers, queers.